Excellencies, panelists, ladies and gentlemen, participants, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this timely discussion today in this webinar that the OECD Development Center is proud to co-organize with the Office of the High Representative and with the Foundation for Studies and Research on International Development, FERDI. We will focus today on a very important topic, notably how development finance can address the vulnerability challenge of LDCs, of the least developed countries, and other developing countries, notably by improving the allocation and supporting structural transformation. This webinar is a follow-up to a very successful discussion that we held back in October, that we co-organized together with the Office of the High Representative for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. And I am pleased to welcome
I'll just stay on until you get in, okay?
I am pleased to welcome here Her Excellency Fekita Utoikamanu, and together with the Commonwealth Secretariat, and I'm also very pleased to welcome Secretary General Patricia Scotland. Secretary General, you're welcome. So before entering into the content of the seminar, let me give you some ground rules, some engagement rules. The seminar is going to be hosted in both English and French. And so for those of you who prefer to speak or to listen into French, veuillez s'il vous plaît utiliser l'interprétation. There is an interpretation button that you can use in your Zoom. And we will have immediately after this introduction, a short setting the scene, followed by a panel discussion that we hope will be as lively as possible and that will help us to identify some concrete proposal on the issue of vulnerability and productive transformation that could be brought to the 5th UN high-level conference on the least developed countries in Doha in 2022. Let me say just very briefly why this discussion is so important and so timely. First, we all know that developing countries, and in particular the least developed countries, suffer from multiple vulnerabilities, including limited economic and trade diversification, a high dependence on a handful of partner countries, and a heavy reliance on activities that are exacerbating their environmental vulnerability. Some of them, including the LDCs and the SIDS, also face challenges associated with their economic size. These vulnerabilities pose a risk for these countries to be trapped into a self-reinforcing cycle, which our friends and Patrick Guillamon here has described as being caught in the trap. And this cycle hampered their capacity to progress towards sustainable development. Today, in the panel discussion, we are going to put the spotlight on two important interrelated questions. The first is how...
à l'ordre du jour. Tout d'abord, comment peut-on mesurer la vulnérabilité et comment peut-on lutter?
And second, we're going to discuss about how developing countries themselves can put in place strategies that can reduce these vulnerabilities by strengthening the productive diversification, the productive capacities of their economies. Without further ado, I hope that we will have a very productive discussion. And let me give the floor now to Her Excellency, the UN High Representative for the LDCs, landlocked developing countries and small island developing states, Madame Fekita Utoikamanu. Madame Fekita, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federico. Good afternoon, good evening to all.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Colleagues, I warmly welcome all participants and panelists to this side event. And I thank the OECD Development Center and FERDI for co-organizing this event with us. You may recall that we already held a joint event last October. So it is good that we can continue our collaboration, and especially so at an important moment in the LDC 5 preparation process. COVID-19 has deepened the existing vulnerabilities faced by the least developed countries. Countries most at risk of being left behind given their limited resources, weak health systems, inadequate social safety nets, severe institutional capacity constraints, underdeveloped physical and technological infrastructure, depriving vast numbers of children and youth from access to remote education, unsustainable levels of debt, and the list of issues is long. According to the 2021 Secretary General's report on the Istanbul Programme of Action, or IPOA, the average share of gross national income provided as ODA to the LDCs from donors declined from 0.1% in 2011 to 0.09% in 2019. This is well below the IPOA targets of 0.15 to 0.2% of GNI. If ODA commitments had been met by that donors, this would have significantly increased the availability of finance, mainly on grant basis, whilst not leading to the creation of additional debt. I can only repeat it again. It is now that the international community must step up and fulfill commitments to the least developed countries. It is also now that we have the opportunity to evaluate how we can support the LDCs. The 5th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries, LDC 5, will take place in January 2022 in Doha, Qatar. The goal is for member states to agree on the next phase program of action for the LDCs. In front of us is a key opportunity to agree on new and innovative approaches to tackling the vulnerability challenges the LDCs face on their road to an inclusive and sustainable development. The preparations for the conference are well advanced. We received national reviews from 28 least developed countries in close collaboration with the national focal points, which have fed into a preliminary report on lessons learned from the Istanbul Program of Action. The organizational session for the LDC 5 conference held in February 8th brought about the election of Bangladesh and Canada as the 2 co-chairs of the LDC 5 PrepCom Bureau, with other members being Qatar, Turkey, Malawi, Uganda, Ethiopia, Nepal, Czech Republic, Paraguay, and Haiti. The regional review for African LDCs and Haiti, hosted by the government of Malawi and UN ECA, took place from February 22nd to the 26th and had nearly 1,000 registered participants from governments, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, private sector, and academia. As we speak, preparations are underway for the Asia Pacific Regional Review taking place from the 28th of June to the 2nd of July, hosted by the government of Bangladesh. And of course, the meetings of the preparatory committee will take place from the 24th to the 28th of May and from the 26th to the 30th of July, 2021. The Ministerial Declaration of the African and Haiti Regional Review meetings noted the importance of addressing now vulnerability challenges faced by the LDCs. The declaration calls for COVID-19 pandemic relief and recovery measures, as well as much needed support measures to address the medium and longer term structural challenges countries face. The LDCs, however, are not the only countries facing vulnerability challenges. Small island developing states, another group OHRLLS advocates for, are amongst the countries with significant challenges due to high and very specific vulnerabilities. To explore ways of how best to address these vulnerabilities, OHRLLS, in collaboration with UN-DESA, coordinates with the UN system to present recommendations to the Secretary General on the possible development and use of a multidimensional vulnerability index. This conversation on how to meaningfully address the vulnerability challenges of LDCs and other vulnerable countries is not new. But finally, we seem to have the momentum needed to examine the criteria that are used to assess and provide support measures to tackle vulnerability. So the next few months presents us with an opportunity we must not miss. It is the opportunity to embed forward-looking and fresh ideas into the next program of action for the LDCs. I look forward to the actionable views and ideas that will come out of our event. Once more, I very much encourage everyone to participate in whatever way you can in the preparations for the LDC 5 conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It's important to remind us that there is a process which is ongoing that will lead us to the conference in Doha. And we see very much this seminar today which takes place in the margin of the Financing for Development Forum, as an opportunity to discuss with a distinguished set of speakers about concrete options, concrete proposals that could contribute to the process that you are leading towards Doha, so that we can arrive in Qatar with some additional ideas that can nurture the reflection and help us reduce this vulnerability and build forward better. With this, let me give now the floor to my dear friend, Patrick Guillamont, who is the president of the FERDI, for his introductory remarks, followed by my colleague, Annalisa Primi. Patrick, à toi.
Voilà, merci beaucoup les uns et les autres. Et Federico, nous sommes ravis à la FERDI d'organiser de nouveau cet événement avec vous. We are so glad to have this new opportunity to collaborate with OHRLLS, and I wish to thank particularly Fekita. Sorry, I have something wrong in my... sorry, so I just wanted to thank Son Excellence Fekita for her wonderful work to prepare this, all these events for in the perspective of the new UN conference on LDC 5. And as said by Federico, this event is following the previous event we had together in October, but with a special purpose, which is to go further and to make some proposals which could help in the preparation of the conference. Alors, je continue en français. Nous sommes heureux que cette réunion ait lieu au moment du Forum pour le financement du développement des Nations Unies, de l'ECOSOC, et à la fois dans cette perspective de la conférence LDC 5, pour passer de l'analyse aux propositions. Je voudrais dire aussi que le contexte actuel est non seulement cette future conférence sur les PMA, mais que nous avons le mois prochain le sommet sur le financement des économies africaines qui va se tenir à Paris, et où le financement des économies africaines, parmi lesquelles il y a la majorité des PMA, devra être reconsidéré. Et c'est au fond, je dirais, dans cette catastrophe due à la crise du Covid, un effet, je dirais, presque un peu réconfortant de savoir que cette crise permet aujourd'hui de reconsidérer la mobilisation des ressources pour l'Afrique et pour les PMA en général, ainsi que la réforme de leur mode d'allocation. Je crois que dans ce malheur que nous connaissons, il y a quelque chose dont il faut tirer profit, c'est bien cela. Alors, je vais présenter en quelques mots le problème de cette réforme de l'allocation en fonction de la vulnérabilité. C'est un thème sur lequel nous avons à la FERDI beaucoup investi depuis une quinzaine d'années, et notamment avec certains des membres qui sont là autour du panel. Et après cette intervention, Annalisa dira quelques mots sur la seconde partie du panel, qui est la transformation structurelle, comment le financement, la réforme du financement des PMA peut contribuer à la transformation structurelle. Et puis, avant d'ouvrir le panel, nous demanderons à Son Excellence Patricia Janet Scotland de faire une sorte de keynote sur la position du Commonwealth Secretariat sur ce sujet. Et puis, nous ouvrirons le panel après, en commençant par les intervenants qui seront peut-être plus spécialement concernés par la question de l'allocation. Et je pense en particulier à notre ami Désiré Vatakachelum, qui est le directeur de la mobilisation des ressources et du financement extérieur à la Banque africaine de développement, ainsi qu'à Félix Fernandez-Chaud, qui est le directeur de la coopération internationale et du développement à la Commission européenne. Et puis ensuite, la parole sera donnée à Estrid Ovnor, qui est directeur de cabinet du Premier ministre du Togo, bienvenue, et ainsi qu'à Asifizur Rahman, directeur général des questions d'OMC au ministère
Trade Office
du Bangladesh. Le Bangladesh, ça a été rappelé, est un acteur très important dans la question des PMA et comme coprésident maintenant de la future conférence, je crois que sa position est, je dirais, particulièrement écoutée. Et puis, le dernier intervenant, non le moins, c'est notre ami Tafer Techafeu qui, lui, en tant que membre du comité des politiques de développement, membre très actif du comité des politiques de développement et qui était auparavant directeur de la division Afrique et pays les moins avancés de la CNUSED, a suivi les questions à la fois de finances, d'allocation et de transformation structurelle. Alors, quelques mots sur le premier thème, qui est celui de l'allocation. Je crois qu'une réforme de l'allocation des ressources concessionnelles qui prennent en compte la vulnérabilité des pays est particulièrement importante pour les PMA et pour les autres pays vulnérables. Il y a ça trois raisons, brièvement. La première, c'est que puisque les PMA sont identifiés comme des pays particulièrement vulnérables, la prise en compte de cette vulnérabilité devrait conduire à allouer plus aux PMA dans l'ensemble des ressources concessionnelles, disons, de l'APD. Cela a été rappelé, on est resté très loin de l'objectif de 0,15-0,20%. On en est, je crois, en 2019 à 0,09%. Je ne sais pas quels seront les chiffres que sortira l'OCDE demain pour l'année 2020, mais je ne pense pas qu'on ait un saut significatif, on verra. Mais en tout cas, on reste très loin de l'objectif, malgré qu'il ait été réitéré maintes et maintes fois dans les réunions internationales. La seconde raison pour laquelle il est intéressant pour les PMA de regarder, d'introduire ce critère, c'est qu'il permet de tenir compte des niveaux relatifs des pays. Quand on a un objectif global, comme le 0,15%, c'est un objectif pour l'ensemble des PMA, mais il ne permet pas de faire la différence entre la vulnérabilité relative des différents PMA, et on sait que cette vulnérabilité est très variable. C'est bien marqué dans l'indice qui fait référence du CDP, le EBI. Troisièmement, et c'est un point qui a été important dans l'histoire de cette idée, c'est que beaucoup de pays qui étaient des PMA sortent de la catégorie, ce que l'on appelle la graduation, et lorsqu'ils sortent, certains, je dirais la majorité de ceux qui sont sortis, étaient justement des pays vulnérables et qui regrettaient que leur vulnérabilité n'ait pas été suffisamment prise en compte. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies, en 2012, a émis une résolution dont l'article 23 que je cite souvent, c'est que les partenaires du développement doivent prendre en compte les critères d'identification des PMA pour l'allocation de leur aide, c'est-à-dire, entre autres choses, puisqu'il y a trois critères, la vulnérabilité structurelle des pays. Et de fait, l'idée d'une allocation selon la vulnérabilité a considérablement avancé depuis une douzaine d'années. Ce dont la FERDI ne peut que se féliciter puisqu'elle a beaucoup poussé cette idée depuis longtemps. Et il faut espérer qu'elle sera précisée et que c'est peut-être quelque chose que nous devons rechercher pour qu'elle soit bien précisée lors de la conférence de Doha et peut-être même avant même lorsque se réunira le sommet de Paris sur le financement des économies africaines. Il y a eu des progrès qui ont été faits dans ce domaine. Permettez-moi de les rappeler. Dès 2014, la Commission européenne a mis en place, Félix pourra nous le confirmer, je vois que sa chaise est vide pour l'instant, mais il va nous rejoindre, la Commission européenne a mis en place un système d'allocation pour le FED, le 10e FED, et pour l'instrument de coopération pour le développement, qui précisément introduisait dans ses critères, c'était une suggestion de la FERDI, là encore, l'indicateur EBI des Nations Unies. Et donc, ça a été quand même un grand progrès sur le plan de la discussion et de la transparence de l'allocation du côté européen. plusieurs banques multilatérales de développement. On soit introduit un critère comme cela depuis longtemps à la Banque caribéenne de développement. Beaucoup plus récemment, la Banque asiatique de développement a fait un pas pour introduire une petite différenciation en fonction d'une prime de vulnérabilité. Et, Désiré pourra nous le dire, la Banque africaine de développement, depuis quelques années, a réfléchi de façon assez approfondie sur la façon dont cette vulnérabilité pourrait être prise en compte sans qu'aucune décision n'ait été encore prise dans ce domaine. Voilà. Alors, la question a été reposée plus récemment lors d'une nouvelle Assemblée générale des Nations unies en décembre dernier, qui, pour le cas des petits États insulaires, a demandé au secrétaire général des Nations unies de s'efforcer que soit mis au point un indicateur de vulnérabilité multidimensionnel pour les petits États insulaires, mais qui puisse éventuellement servir au-delà de ce groupe de pays. Et je crois que c'est important parce que la principale difficulté, mais non la seule, d'une réforme consistant à allouer des fonds concessionnels en partie en fonction de la vulnérabilité, est évidemment le fait qu'il faut pouvoir disposer d'un indicateur qui fasse consensus, d'un indicateur approprié sur lequel les différents bailleurs de fonds puissent s'accorder, ou du moins sur le principe duquel ils puissent s'accorder, même s'ils ont chacun leur indicateur spécifique, comme cela peut être tout à fait normal. Alors cet indicateur, pour pouvoir créer un tel consensus, doit remplir un certain nombre de caractéristiques. Elles sont bien identifiées. La première qui est extrêmement importante et qu'il faut répéter et répéter pour éviter tout malentendu sur cette question de vulnérabilité, dans une formule d'allocation, dans un principe d'allocation où on introduit la vulnérabilité, il faut évidemment que ce soit une vulnérabilité exogène, qu'on appelle aussi structurelle, c'est-à-dire qu'il soit indépendante de la politique présente des pays, même si l'intensité des chocs, l'exposition aux chocs est héritée du passé où la politique passée a joué un rôle, mais elle est héritée par la population et les gouvernements en place, et c'est cette vulnérabilité, je dirais, qui ne dépend pas des pays qui doit être prise en compte. Au contraire, la vulnérabilité qui serait liée à la politique des pays, eh bien, évidemment, elle va plutôt impacter la performance et donc agir dans un sens opposé sur le volume de l'allocation. Seconde caractéristique de l'indicateur, c'est qu'il doit être multidimensionnel. Ça a été clairement rappelé dans la dernière résolution du mois de décembre des Nations Unies, c'est-à-dire qu'il doit être à la fois économique, vulnérabilité économique aux chocs externes et naturels, il doit être une vulnérabilité qui prenne en compte l'impact physique du changement climatique dans ses différentes dimensions, et puis qu'il soit aussi sociétal, car un des grands problèmes, notamment en Afrique et dans beaucoup de PMA, c'est la fragilité politique. Et il faut trouver un moyen de mesurer ce que cette fragilité politique a de structurel à travers, comme on l'a proposé, la récurrence des phénomènes, la violence structurelle, on pourrait dire. Alors, ces différentes formes de vulnérabilité sont très variables. C'est la raison pour laquelle il y a une difficulté à trouver un indicateur qui les embrasse toutes. Mais si on veut que ça soit un instrument d'allocation entre les pays, il faut qu'elle soit variable tout en faisant apparaître la vulnérabilité de chaque pays dans sa spécificité. Et c'est l'enjeu auquel s'attachent beaucoup d'institutions, et notamment le secrétariat du Commonwealth, qui nous en parlera, dont la secrétaire générale nous dira quelques éléments tout à l'heure. Reste un troisième critère qu'on rappelle tout le temps, c'est qu'il faut que l'indicateur ne soit pas trop compliqué, qu'il soit simple, compréhensible et reposant sur des données fiables. La dernière difficulté, et je terminerai par là, c'est une difficulté politique que peut rencontrer l'allocation et que plusieurs d'entre vous connaissent bien. C'est que si on change l'allocation, dans quelque cadre que ce soit, ça peut être les banques multilatérales, ça peut être bilatérales, ça peut être dans d'autres occasions, car cette question va se poser pour l'allocation ou la réallocation des DTS prochainement, il faut que, mais je dirais ça c'est très additionnel, mais dans les banques multilatérales, une question qui est souvent posée, et on entendra certainement cette voix tout à l'heure, c'est que si on diminue la part de certains, si on augmente la part de certains, on va diminuer la part d'autres. Et donc, pour éviter que certains se sentent perdus, pour qu'on ait un optimum où personne ne soit désavantagé, il faut que l'enveloppe globale augmente pour qu'on puisse augmenter la part qui va aux plus vulnérables sans diminuer trop la part, sans diminuer le montant absolu que les autres vont retenir. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle le contexte présent, qui associe la perspective d'une augmentation des ressources concessionnelles pour l'Afrique et au-delà pour les PMA et d'autres pays vulnérables, offre une occasion, je dirais, unique, historiquement unique, de procéder à cette réforme des critères d'allocation et de prendre en compte la vulnérabilité dont l'importance a été tellement soulignée par la crise du Covid. Voilà, je voulais dresser ce tableau de façon peut-être un peu longue, mais pour que notre discussion puisse être vraiment orientée sur cet élément que nous aimerions pouvoir proposer à la prochaine conférence des PMA sur conférence PMA 5. Peut-être Annalisa, quelques mots pour l'aspect complémentaire de. Can you just say a few words about this other side of the meeting?
Avec plaisir, Patrick. Merci beaucoup. Je vais parler en anglais. So it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you and to see so many friends and partners to discuss such an important topic. So just let me make the connection between the very important point Patrick has mentioned and the issue of the economic transformation that was highlighted by Federico in his opening remarks and by Fekita Modea, our High Representative for the LDCs. So continuing advancing in the measurement agenda on countries' vulnerabilities, it's a key pillar in the quest for an updated agenda for development and to update international support measures in what we hope will soon be a post-COVID landscape. When discussing about vulnerabilities in developing countries, a key dimension is linked to the production structure and the economic specialization. And why so? Federico mentioned it very clearly at the beginning. Too often, these economies depend on commodity exports. They suffer of a lack of diversification, specialization in low-end parts of the global supply chains. They're specialized sometimes in natural resource-based activities. These elements sometimes cause detrimental impact on their environmental ecosystem. So there is a major vulnerability dimensions linked to the characteristics of their production structure. Now, why does economic transformation matter? Well, because normally structurally stronger and more diversified economies tend to be less vulnerable to external, but also to internal shocks. Because what a country produces and what a country trades and how it does it, it shapes the rents that are generated, so the quantity of the wealth that is generated, but also how rents are distributed into the economic system and the society. It shapes, for example, to what extent homegrown firms or small and medium enterprises are able to benefit from trade and investment. So it has a major impact. However, achieving economic transformation, even if it's possible, and history offers us examples, so development, it's not something that naturally happens, but it is possible to change the economic structure, but the process is not automatic and it is not simple. So a great deal of effort is needed to achieve economic transformation at the strategic level, at the planning level, at the implementation level, and at the financing. And the complexities, but also the opportunities associated with economic transformation in the current global economic landscape are increasing. And of course, I don't need to mention to all of us the dramatic crisis, which is an economic and an health emergency that we are living, but also the unfolding changes in the global geopolitical landscape and the major technological revolution that will require to reshape how the economy and the society works, matched with the quest for environmental sustainability, which is, let's say, a known dismissible goal for the whole world. Now, just to to talk about this economic transformation and introduce the debate as follows, I wanted just to share 3 words that I think we can link to the complexity of economic transformation for LDCs and other vulnerable economies today. And the 3 words I would like you to go away with are direction, speed, and ambitiousness. So direction, because the key issue is not only to transform the economy, it's to transform the economy towards what? And this is why in the panel, we are gonna hear from countries, what are their views and towards what? A key issue is to transform the economies to achieve job-rich, innovation-based, and industrially diversified growth. This is a major challenge, but it is important that this transformation addresses these 3 points: the jobs, the innovation capacity, and the industrial diversification. Now, this is a way that will support LDCs to achieve their progress in the path towards prosperity, and there is no unique way to achieve that. I think that for us at the Development Center, this is very important, even though we say economic transformation and there is a direction, there is no way, not one unique pathway, and also not one unique objective. We're not advocating for every country to specialize in the same area. We're just saying that it is important that there is a view towards achieving an economic transformation that is compatible with the well-being of the people and the planet. And this requires a major strategy process in the countries, partnerships among different actors, and the capacity to make investment channeling towards the priorities. A big issue is the issue of transforming the economies, making the best of the digital revolution. So not being dragged by this technology, but drive the technological development towards what are the aspirations and needs of LDCs and developing economies, and to make it really compatible with the environment. And this issue of the direction entails the need for discussing production transformation with a multi-level stakeholder framework, with the local level, at the national level, and also at the multilateral agenda. This makes the industrial, let's say, industrial policy debate a little bit more complex today than in the past. The second word is speed, in the sense that we can't keep waiting. We've been talking about production transformation for a long time. This issue is urgent because the economies are, like the global economies, investing a lot of resources to try and get our economies back on track. There will be major economic transformations. We cannot afford that LDCs or other vulnerable economies are left behind. And here there are some dimensions which some people might think they're very basic agendas, but we need to close this gap and we need financing addressed to them. So there is an issue of closing the digital gap, both in the terms of the skills area, but also in terms of infrastructure, and enabling the countries to fully participate to a new paradigm, which will reshape our life. I mean, the transition towards digital has been immensely accelerated by the reaction to COVID and the fact that we have to live and operate online now. We have to be sure countries don't face a challenge, and every citizen in every country is able to enter into that. The other word that I wanted to mention is ambitiousness. Here I'm quoting my friend at Zhu Chang. This has been always a very important ingredient in successful transformation strategies. So, and too often our international community has been a little bit conservative when talking about economic transformation. We have been saying that we call for rationalization for developing countries' aspirations and vision in the name of governance difficulties, in the name of efficiency challenges. While nowadays ambitiousness and the views and aspirations of developing countries and LDC matter even more, because there will be a lot of resources injected into the economic transformation, and the disparities and divergence could be higher. If you look at how much is expended in terms of the package for COVID, economic related COVID recovery measures, around 85% is being invested and spent by OECD economies, 7% by China, 2% by India. And developing economies have not been inert, they have been active. Like there is a country with whom we are working on production transformation, which is Egypt, with the support of the German Development Corporation. Egypt has made a commendable effort. They invested 1.4% of their GDP in economic relief measures to support the economy after COVID. But try to compare this with the recent release program by Japan, which is about kickstarting the economy back with industry and manufacturing at the core, which is around 14% of the GDP. Those are important differences, not to mention the big debate we are all following about taxing global multinational companies to support the 2 trillion USD US plan for recovery, which has at the core infrastructure, renewable energy, and within that manufacturing. So the issue of ambitiousness for developing countries, it is important, and they need time and opportunities for experimenting and for implementing their vision. So let's say that direction, speed, and ambitiousness will be very key in supporting LDCs in defining their vision and aspiration for economic transformation and to mobilize the necessary support. Now, at the Development Center, we have been working on those issues for quite a long time now, and we do believe and we do have evidence that resources matter and that channeling resources to economic transformation, it's really what avoids plans to be like empty wishes or a nice declaration of a lot of objectives. However, we also believe that resources are not enough. So they're super necessary, but they need to be managed and they need to be steered towards and through very complex processes of coordination with different stakeholders, to alignment and negotiations with the private sector, with investors, with foreign partners. And developing countries need the space to learn in policymaking implementation, and they need the policy space for experimenting and for using the flexibilities to achieve their own pathway towards development. So for us, what we're bringing to this debate is, in complement to the discussion of the specific financing support measures, is to bring this element of supporting the policy learning processes. We do this through tools, open policy dialogue for peer learning on equal footing between countries. And we have developed a tool, which is the production transformation policy reviews. Probably some of the colleagues will mention it later. We have the chance that we will start in June, the production transformation policy review of Bangladesh, thanks to the support of the European Commission and in cooperation with the Announced Integrated Framework, the CDP and its secretariat, with a view also to learn how to adapt this tool to other LDCs and supporting them for their graduation. So Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci. You are finished? So, okay. Bon, merci beaucoup, Annalisa. We have now the chance to hear Patricia Janet Scotland as Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and she has accepted to give a keynote on the perception by the Commonwealth Secretariat of this important issue of financing vulnerable countries, and in particular LDCs with respect to their vulnerability. Patricia, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Good afternoon, good evening, Your Excellencies, representatives from the UN and the OECD, specially invited guests, my dear friends. It's a real pleasure to be invited here today to speak on the issue of advancing financing for development for the least developed and other vulnerable countries at this joint UN and OECD forum. And I'm sure that many of you will be aware of the long-term engagement by the Commonwealth Secretariat in advocating for special assistance to vulnerable countries. Indeed, since the 1960s, highlighting the issue of vulnerability and the need to recognize the special needs of small states has been a key program of work for the Commonwealth Secretariat. And this is quite natural, bearing in mind that 60% of our Commonwealth members, that's 32 countries, are small and vulnerable, with 13 members also being classified as least developed countries. And although our emphasis has customarily been on concessional finance assistance to improve financing for development outcomes in small states, we also work very closely with the World Trade Organization on the supply side issues affecting least developed countries, in particular, those relating to their ability to overcome structural barriers which impede expansion of their trade. And we've recently seen clear instances of the harm such structural barriers cause to least developed countries as well as to small states. Even though their COVID-19 controls and responses have generally been well managed, least developed and small vulnerable countries are amongst the hardest hit in terms of losses to potential GDP, impacts on jobs and livelihoods, and increases in poverty. There should be no doubt now, if indeed there ever was, that these countries need very specific support if they are to achieve their targets as set out in their various development agendas, amongst them the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals and SDGs, the Addis Ababa Third Conference on Financing for Development, and the Istanbul Plan of Action and the Samoa Pathway. Our Commonwealth foreign ministers recognized this at their meeting in London in 2018 and directed the Commonwealth Secretariat to work towards achieving global agreement on the definition and measurement of vulnerability, noting that such agreement is crucial to expanding the criteria upon which concessional financing assistance is provided. And it has long been our Commonwealth understanding that per capita GDP as a single criterion does not accurately reflect the needs of the least developed nor of the vulnerable. And whilst commendable progress has been made with provision for assistance for least developed countries, notably in terms of the LDC criteria created by the UN Committee for Development Policy, more appropriate criteria for access to concessional resources by small states are urgently needed. And in answering the call of our Commonwealth foreign ministers, we set out at the Commonwealth Secretariat to deliver for our members a methodology and means for defining and measuring vulnerability, which could be globally accepted and could possibly complement GDP per capita as a criterion for access to financing. Now, accordingly, we have devised a universal vulnerability index developed in collaboration with our partner FERDI. And this is an opportunity for me to thank Patrick, because in his opening, I think he set out 3 really important issues that have to be grappled with. And I think in our Commonwealth Universal Vulnerability Index, which is multidimensional, dynamic, and inclusive through its coverage of 138 developing countries, I think we may just about manage to have done that and met the aspirations about which Patrick, you framed this conversation right at the beginning. Now, in the Commonwealth Universal Vulnerability Index, we derive a measurement of vulnerability consistent with that which could be used to describe any vulnerable country. In particular, we consider not only countries' exposure to shocks, but also the impact of the frequency and intensity of past shocks, as well as the resilient factors which help to mitigate the impact of shocks on sustainable development. Additionally, given the importance of understanding the source and nature of vulnerability and resilience, we divide the Universal Vulnerability Index into 2 very important components, namely structural and non-structural factors. And these differentiate between the factors which are exogenous and beyond the reach of governments, and those which are within the control of governments, particularly with regard to resilience to shocks. And it is my firm belief that this expression of vulnerability will lead to a transformation of our understanding of the impediments which countries face, particularly by presenting vulnerability trends through time as well as by economic, environmental, and social metrics. And furthermore, understanding is deepened by the identification of both structural and non-structural impediments to resilience, and insights emanating from our Commonwealth Universal Vulnerability Index framework are already fascinating and we think really far-reaching. So I welcome the opportunity to share these with you in brief today within the context of advancing financing for development for least developed and other vulnerable countries. Our Commonwealth UVI confirms that least developed countries are the most vulnerable countries in the world, while small states or SIDS make up the second most vulnerable group. And probably the most striking conclusion from the 2018 assessment is that the income is not a predeterminant of a nation's vulnerability, but rather of resilience. So by using the median ranking of the UVI, we find that upper middle income countries show higher vulnerability than lower middle income countries. We also find that the highest levels of vulnerability occur in Africa, closely followed by the Pacific and Caribbean regions. And a final point on the results and conclusions we draw is that although small states are not the most vulnerable when factoring resilience, they are on a par with the least developed countries when assessing strictly structural vulnerabilities. And the index and these results have been welcomed by representatives of member countries on our Commonwealth Secretariat Board, and our expectation would be that at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting later in June this year, the Universal Vulnerability Index will be endorsed as the main barometer of vulnerability by the nations of the Commonwealth, representing, as we do, a third of humanity. And my sincere hope is that all OECD countries, all of them, will also endorse the UVI for the benefit of LDCs and small states and work to create a better system for aid allocation consisting of a per capita income and vulnerability criterion. Indeed, a promising moment of opportunity is upon us. Just 4 days ago, at the opening of the IMF World Bank spring meetings, the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, said though income level is the primary consideration for dispersing international assistance, we should look into other factors of vulnerability as we think of ways to support developing countries. And this statement was in relation to the G20 agreement and support for upscaling national SDR allocations for support during COVID-19, which have so far included only low-income countries and excluded other vulnerable countries, particularly small states. With the IMF clearly considering ways and being open to ideas as to how other vulnerable countries might be supported, we shall be proposing that our Commonwealth Comprehensive Index could be a useful tool. I would hope too that our participation in the UN technical webinars this week, in the context of the recent UN resolution to agree a globally accepted vulnerability index, might lead to our Commonwealth UVI being regarded as a valuable global contribution worthy of General Assembly endorsement. The new UN resolution aligns closely with the 2018 mandate from Commonwealth foreign ministers, which has guided our work, and it also reflects our MOU with the UN, which includes the objective of working together to achieve a commonly agreed vulnerability index. So, as you can see, the momentum is finally, some of us would say, with us. And I hope that we can also join with the OECD in bringing to realization the idea of a globally agreed vulnerability index. And my team will be available to brief you in detail on our UVI, and I am sure that we shall also be able to count on FERDI to continue providing excellent technical support. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank Patrick and FERDI again for the kind invitation to participate and speak at this forum, and look forward to continuing our deep collaboration between the Commonwealth Secretariat and the UN-OHRLLS and the OECD on the important issue of vulnerability and financing for development. And I hope, Patrick, that you will be conscious that this vulnerability, Universal Vulnerability Index, was for me a dream, which I was hoping would one day come true. So you are part of the dream maker. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for this so nicely expressed views. I am very proud to be a dreamer. And we do hope that the dream will become reality. So we now should hear the distinguished panelists. I suggest that first we begin by those two who are most concerned by the talk given by Patricia Janet Scotland, because these two have deep experience in this issue of allocation and vulnerability. And may I ask first Desiree Vintakashelum, then Felix Fernandez-Shaw to give their view. Desiree, we had a long way together. Nous avons fait un long chemin ensemble sur ce sujet, et ce serait heureux que vous nous disiez votre perception actuelle du sujet, compte tenu de toutes les contraintes qui s'y rapportent. Et ensuite, peut-être Félix Fernandez-Shaw, qui est en charge de ces questions à la Commission européenne, et qui se souvient, nous avons, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, a été un peu, je dirais, le pionnier dans l'introduction d'analyse de vulnérabilité dans la formule d'allocation en 2014. Désiré.
Merci Patrick, et Excellences, Mesdames, Messieurs, chers membres du panel, merci pour cette invitation. Tout d'abord, juste en préambule, je m'exprime en mon nom personnel et bien sûr pas au nom du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement. Et ce que je dis n'engage pas la banque. I'd like to thank all of you for bringing this topic to the front, in particular the OECD Development Center and the FERDI. As Patrick indicated, we have discussed this topic, Patrick, and I went back to my notes since 2007. And it's really opportune that we talk about it now, because we are all living in a world of vulnerability and enhanced fragility. I think you said it. If this crisis has highlighted one thing, it's what we've put in our fragile states strategy. It's that vulnerability is a continuum. And I think Excellency, the Commonwealth Secretariat, Ms. Baroness Scotland has said it very well. Sometimes the results is a bit counterintuitive. Sometimes it's those countries which have quite a high GNI per capita, which are actually the most vulnerable. So thank you for that, Baroness, and I'll definitely go and get a copy of your work, of the work of your team. I'll just want to make 3 broad points for the sake of time, and because there's quite a number of panelists. One, I'm a practitioner. As Patrick said, I'm not going to be speaking from a theoretical perspective, but more as a practitioner of concessional resource allocation. I want to share with the panel a couple of examples of transactions that we've done at the African Development Bank Group, which speaks very well to what Annalisa said about resilience creating the productive capacity, and where we see those resources going. The second one, it's to talk, Patrick, about this issue you raise is, can we and should we and how do we change the resource allocation framework? And what is the best way or the optimal way to do it? And finally, the way forward, all that in less than 5 minutes. So let me zoom in directly on the examples. And I'm very pleased to see Felix here, because the first example I'm going to use is what we jointly did in Burkina Faso on Yelin projects, Desert to Power. I don't know if you know about this project, Felix, but it is a deal we did together on rural electrification, mini-grid, not off-grid, but mini-grid, where we put in, Patrick, on performance-based allocation, less than 4 million euros, and we leverage it 20 times. A big part of it came from the EC. The EC put in a little bit less than 7 million. The GCF, the Green Climate Fund, put in 21 million. And the first point I'm going to make is, as we speak of resource allocation framework, an important leverage factor of the use of concessional resources is private sector. In that particular deal, members of a panelist, 42 million out of 75 came from the private sector, thanks to concessional resources. So thank you to the EC. The African Development Bank Group is the lead on that transaction. But lead does not mean you put all the scarce resources in it. It means you crowd in other parties to the table. And Annalisa, this mini grid actually is fantastic because it allows you to operate machinery. It allows this kind of transformation to happen. And Patrick will be happy to learn that there's a big chunk of another project which feeds into that, which is financed by Agence Française de Développement. So the first message that I have, which in my view is, one, collaborate, partnership is super important as we look at resource allocation for the most vulnerable. The second one, and the second example I'm going to use, is on scaling up. Scaling up can only be done if we are creative enough in the use of concessional resources. And the example I'm going to use is the private sector facility, which is again something which is coming from the African Development Fund, seed capital. And with it, we share risk with the African Development Bank on non-sovereign operations. So we leverage €1 or $1 for $4 of non-sovereign operations. Members of the panel, this facility has been in operation for 5 years. We've done 52 operations, all of them in low-income African country, which Baroness Scotland rightly pointed out, are the most vulnerable. Make a guess. How many of those 52 operations do you think have gone belly up? One. We've had one claim, just one in 5 years. So Patrick, as we think of the resource allocation framework to address fragility, vulnerability, opening it up to crowding and to go to scale is very important. And it is the last point that you made, Patrick. It is the scale. It is important as we go for replenishment, but we don't only talk about resource allocation framework, but also we go to scale. So these are the two examples I wanted to use to illustrate some of the conversations we've been having, because going it alone will not do it. All of us partner, but also partner with you know, the private sector, super important. Now, on the resource allocation framework proper, Patrick, you said it all. We need a framework which is simple, which is transparent, which is predictable, you know, because Togo is here, for instance. We use the resource allocation framework to engage with countries, to have a dialogue. So countries need also to own the system, and resources must be predictable. We don't want a system with ups and downs from 1 year. You can't plan. You know, you can't build a road if this year I tell you you have $50 million, and next year I tell you, oh, by the way, no, now it's 10. I mean, I think the director of cabinet from Togo would not be very happy if this would be to happen. Now, the real question, Patrick, is how do we zoom in on truly structural vulnerability indices, which are simple and that can easily be used for a dialogue with countries. My own reflection, and this is my own view, not the African Development Bank view, is we can do it by using very simple metrics. For instance, in today's world, we know that climate change has increased the vulnerabilities of all low-income countries, and we know those countries have not contributed or contributed very, very little to the issue of climate change. So that's something I think, Patrick, we can zoom in and have a really robust engagement on metrics. The second one, I think, which is super important, and you pointed it out, Patrick, when we were discussing in the past, it's the regional aspect of vulnerability. Vulnerability, conflict do not know borders. If something is happening in your next door country neighbor and you have nothing to do with it, then clearly that is an issue. So these are, so I received your question. To answer your question is multinational, multivariable metrics, yes, for analytical purposes. I think the work done by the Commonwealth Secretariat is fantastic, but for allocation purposes, it may be good to zoom in on a few key metrics or indicators where we can actually pinpoint the structural vulnerabilities. And in the current context, structural vulnerabilities related to climate and to insecurity in a particular path may work well. At the African Development Bank, you know, we've been thinking about that. We are exchanging with our donors, our group, and we'll be having a meeting soon on that. So in summary, and just to conclude, I think we need a coordinated approach, and the work done by Patrick is very important. It creates this public good of knowledge. And if we can rally all the different partners around this public good, I think that would be fantastic. However, we need scaling up. We need scaling up of concessional resources. It's a difficult conversation to have in today's world because donors and we also need the beneficiaries to come up to the table and express their views. So I'm very happy and I'll listen very closely to what both Bangladesh and Togo will say. Last but not least, Patrick, I cannot end by making a special plea on an issue which is very topical and relates to vulnerability. It's the issue of debt and debt sustainability. In today's world, due to COVID-19, we need urgent action. And Annalisa, you spoke about now is the time to do more. But the DSSI, the Debt Suspension Initiative, which has been pushed to end of the year, it's fantastic, addresses the liquidity, we need to look at the solvency issue. And that is a real challenge that we all need to come together and fix. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Désiré. You raised so many questions. Je me restreins de vouloir répondre avant de passer la parole à Félix, car il y a beaucoup de questions qui devront être traitées par les autres panélistes. Permettez-moi, juste en faisant la transition avec l'intervention de Félix Fernandez-Chaud, de vous dire que beaucoup de questions que vous avez posées me semblent avoir une réponse dans l'indicateur que Son Excellence Patricia Janet Scotland a présenté, car précisément ce caractère structurel que vous avez souligné est au cœur de l'approche du secrétariat du Commonwealth. Et si la mesure de la vulnérabilité, cette matrix, is structural, it will be predictable as well. And that's a very strong point. Et naturellement, dans l'aspect structurel, la vulnérabilité au climat est particulièrement importante. Mais la grande difficulté, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, c'est que les formes de vulnérabilité diffèrent selon les pays, qu'il faut pouvoir capter ce qu'il y a de structurel, mais en même temps de spécifique dans les différents pays. Je passe la parole à Félix Fernandez-Chaud, qui a toute l'expérience de l'Union européenne sur ces questions et qui a fait l'expérience d'introduire un indicateur de vulnérabilité en 2014 dans le FED, où il y avait beaucoup de PMA, et dans le DCI aussi. Félix.
Merci, Patrick. I think in English you would say I'm having a field day. Not sure how you would say it in French, but peut-être si tu me donnerais la parole à la fin, après avoir entendu la baronesse Scotland dire que tu es parti de son rêve, moi, ce que je voulais dire, que je l'ai vu avant, Patrick, moi. Il a travaillé avec moi en 2013. Donc, voilà. Et après, Désiré qui a raconté cette jolie histoire about grid in Burkina, je suis vraiment, enfin, je préférerais peut-être la prochaine fois parler de dernier. Comme ça, il y aurait d'autres. But allow me, Patrick and Federico, to thank you a lot. It's very important to take a step back and look at the whole issue on vulnerabilities in the perspective of the incoming LDC conference. I'd like to say a couple of things. First, it is true that with Patrick, we developed and we introduced in the union's method for allocation in 2014. We developed a certain methodology to allocate the funding worth more than, at the time, 35 billion euros for 7 years. And I think this was very important because the economic vulnerability indicator represented a number of issues: structural constraints to growth, exposure to and incidence of exogenous shocks, and we correlated positively with the volume of the allocation. So there was a direct impact. But we are 7 years down the line, or maybe 8, and I think we've seen a bit of changes. I don't think we've seen a lot of changes in the world. We've seen a lot of changes in how we look at the world, or maybe how the world reacts at how we look at the world. And one of the things that we have now working on introducing for the next allocation methodology is climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. Because we feel that we need to press on further. If you look at the UNDP report this year and last year, you will see climate change as one of the main sources of inequalities. And you will also see how UNDP has taken a courageous step to introduce material footprint and CO2 emissions in its Human Development Index. And I think that needs to let us think a bit on how do we confront these issues, because sustainable development cannot be measured any longer by where you get to. It also needs to be measured by how much you're using to get there, because the incoming generations will not have it at their disposal. And I think this is a very important element we need to put in our place. We have started studying that. What we don't have, and I think this pandemic has clearly showed us that we need to have one, is what do we do with digitalization? I think these days, this year has showed us how quickly we can all go into digitalization. We're doing it today. It also shows us how vulnerable you are if you're not able to access the broadband and the internet, and second, if you don't know how to use it. And that is going to be a very important vulnerability element for the years to come. The third element that I would like to introduce into the discussion on allocations is, I think Desiree said it, and a fellow panelist Fekita also said it. It's about risk. And as one of the major ODA providers, one of the lessons we've learned is when you're vulnerable, you can't respond to risks. You cannot plan them. You just need to go with them. And this is one of the things that I think we should be looking at: how to work with risk, how to plan for it, and how to cope it. And one of the issues in terms of allocations, Desiree again said it very well, is how to de-risk international investment. I think one of the Q&As by one of the colleagues, I think from India, is saying, where are all these trillions that should go into billions? Where are they? Well, they're staying home. They're staying home because they don't want to take the risk. And one of the new elements that we have for the incoming European Union budget is the possibility to guarantee sovereign lending and private sector investment. Because there is plenty of financing out there, it's just not going where we think it should go. And therefore, one of the things we want to do, one of the main tools we want to use, is to guarantee investments, to de-risk them, so that they can go to the partner countries we are very much interested in, and be a complement to the ODA grant funding that we normally have. Finally, I would like to probably leave another issue on which we're working very closely in the G20, with the UNDP and UNDESA, with OECD, with Federico, and the IMF and the World Bank. It's very important to know, particularly in these days of pandemic and global recovery, is what is the financing for, and how do we increase that financing? One of the elements that we have been working with lately is already a 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda proposal for integrated national financing frameworks. If we want to go out of the crisis, we will need to plan what is our financial strategy. What are our financial resources, whether they are private or public, whether they are domestic or international? How does a country plan to mobilize its own financial resources, whether it's owned or its friends owned or the markets owned? And this, again, we've learned a lesson on debt. Debt is being handled these days as it has been handled always. But many of the countries that have a debt problem these days have not had this problem because of bad economic decisions or bad economic governance. They've just had it because everyone has stopped. The whole economy in the world is in lockdown. How we deal with this? Then back to my question of de-risking. Normally, capital will say, uh-oh, we got a problem, we pull back. Well, precisely, this is not the moment to pull back. This is the moment to push forward. And what you see capital doing is precisely that, pulling back. So I would like to leave this other idea on the financing strategies. It's very important, I think, to have partner countries decide how they're going to promote their own sustainable development, not only in terms of policy targets, but also in terms of financial resources. And that's where the allocations, that's where the financing should go, and that's where it should point. There where partner countries decide, I want to grow my domestic market, I want to grow my tax base, I want to grow my access to international markets, I want to increase my borrowing capacity. How do you do all this? You need to strategize and to plan, and I think we will be trying to de-risk and bring what is necessary. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Merci beaucoup, Félix, pour ces remarques extrêmement pertinentes et qui permettent de resituer ce problème de l'allocation dans la question générale de la stratégie du financement et qui sont très complémentaires de celles qui ont été présentées. Et je crois que cette issue, ce problème du de-risking est vraiment essentiel et doit être pris en compte dans la stratégie d'allocation. C'est une autre façon de répondre à la vulnérabilité et de prendre en compte la vulnérabilité aussi. Peut-être on va passer aux autres intervenants avec un peu de retard. Excusez-nous, je pense qu'on pourra déborder un petit peu. On peut peut-être entendre M. Ombor. Est-ce que, Federico, tu veux prendre le
Merci, Patrick. Je vais prendre le relais. Merci beaucoup. Je vais être un modérateur impitoyable. Je vais essayer de garder le temps pour permettre aussi d'avoir peut-être une deuxième tour de questions. Et je voudrais demander, alors dans l'ordre, à Estri Omevor, qui est le chef de cabinet de la première ministre du Togo, une question concernant comment vous, les gouvernements du Togo, vous regardez la question de la vulnérabilité. Nous avons entendu ici que la vulnérabilité est une source de problèmes pour le développement et que nous devons faire face à des vulnérabilités exogènes, mais nous avons aussi des vulnérabilités qui sont plutôt liées à la structure productive et qui donc peuvent être aussi prises en charge ou adressées, si vous voulez. Et le Togo a mis en place un programme, une stratégie justement pour essayer de diversifier son économie, de promouvoir la transformation productive pour faire face à les vulnérabilités qui sont liées à cette structure productive qui est un peu concentrée. J'aimerais bien savoir quelles sont les lignes prioritaires que vous avez prises et comment vous voyez ce débat de la vulnérabilité et de la transformation productive. S'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi de prendre part à ce webinaire qui interroge la problématique du financement du développement en lien avec les besoins de transformation structurelle des PMA dans un contexte marqué par une vulnérabilité, certes, et j'imagine de plus en plus accrue au niveau des pays, vulnérabilité encore aggravée par la pandémie de la COVID-19. J'adresse mes chaleureuses salutations aux éminentes personnalités qui prennent part à ces échanges. Mesdames et messieurs, le Togo a effectivement, ces dernières années, mis en place des stratégies de développement qui misent sur les avantages comparatifs du pays, tout en tenant compte de la vulnérabilité interne et externe du pays. Vous savez, le Togo est un petit pays géographiquement, mais de par sa position stratégique au cœur de la sous-région ouest africaine, tire énormément d'avantages des relations économiques et commerciales avec ses partenaires de la sous-région et vise inévitablement à pouvoir, donc, de par là, donc, conquérir un peu plus les marchés internationaux. À titre de cette stratégie, le gouvernement a mis en place en 2018 notamment un plan national de développement pour la période 2018-2022 avec pour ambition de faire du Togo un véritable hub logistique d'excellence dans la sous-région, une économie dynamique, attractive, axée sur des pôles de transformation agricole et industrielle, en renforçant bien évidemment le développement social et le mécanisme d'inclusion. Malheureusement, la pandémie de la COVID-19 qui a bouleversé les certitudes de par le monde et le Togo, bien évidemment, a dû réinventer, recentrer sa stratégie d'intervention sur des points focus précis. En l'occurrence, le Togo a recentré sa politique de développement sur un certain nombre de priorités dans le cadre d'une feuille de route gouvernementale 2020-2025 qui prend appui sur le plan de développement mais qui tient compte véritablement des véritables enjeux du développement qui ont été mis à mal par les chocs exogènes et qui, à la lueur des problèmes de vulnérabilité, méritent effectivement d'être adressés de manière assez pointue et spécifique pour justement fonder plus solidement les bases structurelles donc, de ce développement économique. Et cette feuille de route mise sur 3 axes stratégiques majeurs, notamment le renforcement de l'inclusion, de l'harmonie sociale, la dynamisation de la création d'emplois en se fondant sur les forces de l'économie, et puis la modernisation du pays en modernisant les structures. Ces 3 axes stratégiques qui caractérisent cette feuille de route est déclinée dans un certain nombre de projets prioritaires, une quarantaine, véritablement orientés sur les véritables leviers de la transformation structurelle, les véritables avantages comparatifs du Togo, et notamment sur les dimensions sur lesquelles le Togo doit véritablement travailler pour renforcer sa résilience afin notamment de pouvoir garantir la couverture santé et l'accès universel aux soins, d'offrir une éducation de qualité accessible à tous et véritablement orientée vers le marché du travail en essayant de professionnaliser davantage encore les enseignements pour faire de la ressource humaine véritable catalyseur du développement socio-économique du Togo, faire de l'agriculture aussi un véritable moteur de croissance et de création d'emplois, affirmer donc la place du Togo en tant que hub logistique dans la sous-région, hub de services et hub logistique, créer des véritables industries extractives et manufacturières, faire du Togo une référence digitale. Là, c'est également une volonté politique très forte et bien évidemment aussi renforcer l'attractivité auprès des investisseurs, étant donné qu'aujourd'hui, aucun pays ne peut espérer résolument conduire sa politique de développement si les actions ne sont pas mises en œuvre dans le cadre de partenariats dans lesquels contribue énormément le secteur privé. Mais bien évidemment, le Togo a bien identifié aussi que réussir ses ambitions de développement exige véritablement de réussir aussi la transformation structurelle de son économie, qui est indispensable donc à l'essor socio-économique du pays. Et c'est dans cette dynamique de travailler à véritablement toucher les fondamentaux de l'économie et réussir la transformation économique que, dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de cette feuille de route gouvernementale, le Togo a opté de réaliser, avec l'appui du Centre de développement de l'OCDE, un examen des politiques de transformation économique qui doivent lui permettre de mieux apprécier sa trajectoire de développement et tout en renforçant et en consolidant les instruments qui peuvent être indispensables à prendre en compte pour mieux assurer la synergie d'action dans les actions intersectorielles et réussir la transformation structurelle de l'économie togolaise. Dans ce cadre-là, l'exercice de revue des politiques de transformation économique qui est placé sous le leadership de son Excellence Madame le Premier ministre de la République togolaise donc, a été lancé récemment, le 11 mars dernier, et a permis de mobiliser autour des acteurs gouvernementaux, à la fois les partenaires de la coopération multilatérale et bilatérale, coopération technique et financière bilatérale et multilatérale, de même que les institutions bancaires, celles de financement du développement, et sans oublier bien évidemment le secteur privé qui aujourd'hui sont une composante essentielle sans laquelle on ne peut espérer réussir véritablement une politique de transformation économique réussie. Bien évidemment.
Si je peux vous demander peut-être de conclure dans 1 minute.
D'accord. Bien évidemment aussi, le Togo va être accompagné par des pays pairs pour pouvoir mutualiser, enrichir son expérience, pour pouvoir justement tirer les leçons. Ce que je voulais dire en plus, c'est que l'accompagnement des pays développés par le renforcement des capacités reste aussi un vecteur majeur. Et nous pensons qu'un accent particulier doit être mis sur l'amélioration des conditions d'accès des PMA au financement. Donc, tout ce qui a été discuté tout à l'heure, nous nous retrouvons bien évidemment, afin de pouvoir soutenir l'effort de mobilisation de ressources pour faire face à la fois au risque de vulnérabilité, mais aussi au défi de la transformation structurelle. Et nos États, notamment les États en Afrique, se sont engagés à stimuler la croissance économique via le commerce intra-régional, promouvoir l'industrialisation, créer des emplois et améliorer la compétitivité des services et des industries. Et je crois que la mutualisation donc des synergies d'action pourrait effectivement permettre d'y parvenir. D'où la nécessité effectivement de travailler en synergie entre pays moins avancés, mais aussi en recherchant un accompagnement spécifique et aligné sur les priorités nationales de ces pays vis-à-vis des pays en développement. Voilà, mesdames et messieurs, quelques mots que je pourrais dire pour contribuer à ce débat que je trouve très enrichissant mutuellement pour nous tous. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Many thanks for this intervention that I think tell us two important aspects that complement what we have heard before. First is that if we change or if we improve the system of allocation of international financing for development to better reflect vulnerabilities, which is something that I think everyone in the panel agrees, we also need to have as a counterpart a government which is able to put in place a strategy to reduce those sources of vulnerability that are not necessarily full exogenous, but are related, for example, to the productive structure. And second, what you said at the end, that in this respect, the strategy for cooperation goes beyond the financing, but requires the engagement of other countries that may have gone through similar challenges. And so this aspect of peer learning and peer-to-peer cooperation is a very important aspect that maybe in the conference in Doha could be further stressed. Let me now move to our friend Afizur Rahman from Bangladesh. And I apologize to you, Afizur, because I understand that it's very late in Dhaka. So we are very grateful for you bearing with us and staying with us. We know that Bangladesh has been a very strong advocate of the LDC cause internationally and regionally, and that you, in your capacity as Director General on WTO issues in the Ministry of Commerce, are particularly knowledgeable about the market access and the measures of the international support system to support LDCs, but also the smooth graduation of the LDCs. So in this respect, also building on what we have just heard from Togo, we would like to understand from your perspective how Bangladesh, which is on track for LDC graduation, but at the same time is also deeply affected by the current crisis, how is the government rethinking and restructuring, if you want, the strategy? And to what extent do you think that a system that would better reflect vulnerabilities in terms of allocating scarce financial resources could support the efforts of a government in this respect to reduce vulnerabilities? Please, the floor is yours, Afizur.
Thank you, moderator. Distinguished panelists, dear audience, good afternoon and Good evening to everybody. Development cooperation is key to success. Nowadays, development finance has become a very effective tool to fight poverty, enhance economic resilience through reducing multiple development impediments. Let me introduce the case of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a densely populated, least developed country in Southeast Asia. Population size is around 165 million within a land area of 144,000 square kilometers. It is the most densely populated country in the world. Bangladesh has been considered for graduation from the LDC status by 2 consecutive triennial reviews and expected to be graduated by 2026. Since its inclusion, it has been struggling with severe poverty, hunger, and malnutrition amid frequent natural disasters like cyclone, flood, drought, loss of agricultural crops, etc. Continuous support from the development partners with effective policy support also. The economy of Bangladesh has become much resilient now. During last 1 decade, the economy has been continuing to grow by more than 7% GDP growth rate in average. COVID-19 pandemic has reduced its growth, but still it remains within 5.2%, where all other Asian countries experience sharp decline in GDP growth. Many socio-economic indicators revealed good health of the economy. Absolute poverty reduced nearly to 14%, which was 22% in 5 years ago. After implementation of the Istanbul Program of Action, Bangladesh could see significant reduction in maternal mortality rate, infant mortality rate, and malnutrition. Life expectancy was around 46 years during 1972 and 75 when Bangladesh was included in the LDC list, but now it is 72.6 years. During last 2 decades, many indicators showed positive results. Adult literacy, share of female in labor force, and enrollment of secondary school. Bangladesh ranked 50th in the Global Gender Gap Index of World Economic Forum, and is only South Asian country in the list of top 100 countries. The country also ranked 7th on the political empowerment of women. The country also taken initiative to implement number of mega projects like the Podda Bridge construction with own funds, establishing nuclear power plant, launching own communication satellite, creating metro rail, and widening highways. Main engine of growth of the country is the trade. Export of RNG to 37 developed and 12 developing countries, where Bangladesh enjoys duty-free and quota-free market access with flexible rules of origin under WTO law. Around 71% of total exports depend on preferential market access. After graduation, such international support measures, especially the market access, will no longer be available for Bangladesh. Highly concentrated export products, mainly RMG, will face average more than 8.7% tariffs in the export market, along with stringent rules of origin. Thus, export may drop drastically. It is estimated that around $7 billion export will be dropped. $1 billion export drop may result in 100,000 job loss, which are mainly occupied by female workers. Pharmaceutical industry in Bangladesh can meet 98% demand of country and can export to many other countries too. Transition period and waiver from patent enforcement under WTO TRIPS agreement till 1st January 2033 for LDCs helped Bangladesh to create a very strong pharmaceutical base in the country. Low-cost medicine helped to maintain longer life expectancy, reduced mortality rate, and keeping overall public health that also contributed national productivity. After graduation, TRIPS exemption will no longer be available and the cost of medicine will be higher for the people. Beyond loss of international support measures, climate change is a major challenge for the country. Due to proximity to Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean, the country remains always vulnerable to frequent flood, tropical cyclone, salinity intrusion, damage of infrastructure and agricultural losses. Bangladesh is the 8th worst hit country by natural disaster according to World Disaster Report 2018. Middle income trap may be another impediment for economic development of Bangladesh. Bangladesh development vision of achieving knowledge-based developed country by 2041 may be hampered due to stuck in the middle income trap. Besides loss of international support measures, climate change effect and COVID-19 pandemic, 1.1 million unexpected refugees from neighboring country posed also economic, social, and environmental risks in the economy of Bangladesh, which is not common to all LDCs. Therefore, vulnerability assessment should be done in multi-dimensional approaches, including taking into consideration of country-specific risk factors. Like Istanbul Program of Action, next 5th United Nations Conference on LDCs may lead the development partners to assess real needs of the LDC for development. For Bangladesh, global initiatives are required for continuing duty-free and quota-free market access for a reasonable period of time after graduation, and allowing graduating LDC to enjoy the full period of declared TRIPS transition period, that is until 1st January 2033, even after the graduation, and allow access to technology bank for graduating nations. Allowing easy and affordable access to knowledge product for graduating and graduated nations. Scaling up concessional supports to enhance productive capacity for LDCs in the pre and post-graduation phase. Pressing global community to materialize their commitment support to climate change, for which many LDCs are innocent victims. Supports also needed for domestic policy intervention, for diversification, expansion, base of industries and exports, exploring market access through negotiation, more private sector investment, and more FDI in high-value industries. Ensure inclusiveness and increased coverage of social safety net, investment in human capital to lift productivity, adapting to climate change to reduce vulnerability, prudent debt management, and to face the job losses by Industry 4. To overcome the uncertainty and risk caused by COVID-19 pandemic and graduation challenges, Government of Bangladesh has undertaken production transformation policy review process with the OECD Development Center and enhanced integrated framework with the financial support from European Union and in cooperation with CDP and its secretariat. The government seeks support from all development partners for sustainable economic development and smooth transition from the LDC status. Let the 5th UN Conference on LDC be a blessing for the LDCs and vulnerable countries in the world. You know, the COVID-19 is severely hitting Bangladesh's economy. Bangladesh has the pharmaceutical base to produce vaccines. If the patent holder, they can allow Bangladesh to produce vaccine in Bangladesh, and the WHO can certify our production system, then Bangladesh can meet up its own demand of vaccine and also can give all other countries to meet up the vaccine requirements. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for giving me the chance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, Hafizur, for staying with us so late and putting at the table a number of very important messages. And I think that, first of all, you reinforce the call that we heard from the very beginning, including from the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, of the importance of looking at vulnerability through a multidimensional approach and to link the distribution, the allocation of resources in a way that allow countries to cope with this vulnerability. But you also put on the table another very important point, that this vulnerability discussion should also be taken into account beyond the allocation of resources when it comes to other measures in the international support system, and that a country, even after graduation, may retain important sources of vulnerability that continue to be addressed. And so I think that we have here a very strong case in support of what was put forward at the beginning by our keynote. Let me now conclude by turning to Tafere, who is a good friend and a member of the Committee on Development Policy. And in this respect, you sit in a privileged position because you are among those that set the criteria for the inclusion or the graduation from the LDC category, but you also advise United Nations members on how best to support a smooth graduation and to improve the international support system that our friend from Bangladesh has just referred to. So in this respect, what I would like to ask you is, having heard all the other speakers and taking into account the discussions that are currently taking place in the Committee on Development Policy, what is your view, Tafere, on this important challenge of addressing vulnerability by having a better allocation of resources? Because this is a two-way discussion. It's how can resources be better allocated to those who are most vulnerable, but also how can resources be allocated to reduce the sources of vulnerability? And in this respect, we have heard from several interventions, notably from Togo, but also from Bangladesh, that the production structure, is a major source of vulnerability, as is the dependence on exports and commodity that with fluctuation can increase the debt and sustainability of countries. So Taf, from your perspective, what should be the key highlight that we should bring to Doha to adequately address this issue of vulnerability and allocations? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, for the opportunity to participate. Patrick, thank you. OECD, OHRLLS, I really appreciate it. Since I'm aware of time is short, I'll make 3 quick points. I think the first one I would like to say is that what distinguishes LDCs from other developing countries in terms of vulnerability, they are extreme and persistent vulnerabilities to external shock. I think Patrick has explained that adequately. One thing that we've learned from the current crisis, the COVID-19 shock, is that it's not discriminatory in the sense that it's not only LDCs, but practically all countries, the vulnerability of all countries have been exposed. It's very interesting to see, because of COVID-19, even the health sector in some advanced economies was pushed to its extreme, and some countries were showing vulnerability. Therefore, it's correct for what I heard many colleagues saying, that the vulnerability issue is not just confined to LDCs or low-income economies. The different version of it is also available, deriving from different factors in other countries as well. But what makes the LDCs sort of, I wouldn't say unique, but a bit different, is their vulnerability emanates from their underdevelopment, the low level of economic development, both in terms of education level and other indicators of development. There are excessive dependence on primary commodities for production and trade. Their limited capacity to mobilize domestic resources. Their excessive reliance on external support for development finance, with all the implications for policy space. Even geographically, they are disadvantaged locations, some of them, which is really difficult for trade and others. So there are all these factors which makes you think that the source of LDC's vulnerability are structural in nature. And addressing their structural impediments requires economic diversification and moving away their economy away from this excessive reliance on commodity exports and subsistent agricultural production. Now, here there is, I think, a broad consensus by now, and LDCs themselves have recognized it, that the root causes of these structural impediments and vulnerabilities in the case of LDCs is their limited development of their productive capacities. This, I think, is gaining recognition. And if we say what are product capacities, the product capacities we're talking about are the diverse competencies, natural and financial resources, skills, infrastructure, technological capabilities, institutions, and systems that a country needs to efficiently and competitively produce progressively more sophisticated goods and services. It is only when countries begin to expand and accumulate such capabilities that they can start to diversify their economies, tackle their structural impediments, and reduce their vulnerabilities. At the end of the day, this has the capabilities that enable countries to achieve what the OECD Development Center calls production transformation. These are also really what differentiates developed from developing countries. Interestingly, in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, we noticed the difference between countries that have developed their product capacities and those that didn't by the panic we saw in some countries, especially in Africa, being not be able to import PPEs and not being able to produce PPEs. That was very revealing. In that respect, among LDCs, it's very interesting that Bangladesh was able to repurpose its capacity, production, manufacturing capacity to produce these PPEs, while other countries like Angola and others had to rely on imports. To make things worse, countries that produce these PPEs start imposing export restrictions. And it was, if you remember, a year ago, it was really revealing. So that shows you that at the end of the day, developing your own productive capacity enables you to start producing the diverse range of goods and services that countries can consume or export, and that way achieve development. This is also linked to structural transformation. Structural transformation is not just simply the gradual shift in importance from agriculture to manufacturing to services, because as countries develop, they do that anyway. But the structural transformation is a qualitative change in the structure of the economy, where the countries are shifting labor and capital from low productivity, low technology, low value activities into higher productive sectors and activities. That is what will differentiate between countries that are moving forward and countries that are stuck. Well, this will take me to the second point I wish to highlight, linked to what you said, that what international community can do to support this in terms of the financing. Well, many things, but I think a couple of them I will highlight. The first one is ensuring that the international support measures enable LDCs to develop their productive capacity instead of simply providing access to markets. I'm saying this because among the international support measures, the really important ones are the preferential market access and the type of waiver and other special arrangements they have in WTO. These are very important. I'm not saying that ODA and others are not important. Of course they are, especially for the smaller LDCs, but the preferential market access is a very important one. And we've seen it. Bangladesh is a classic example of a country that have managed to meet all the criteria for graduation and advance by using effectively the market access opportunity given. And as our friend Hafiza said, in terms of the pharmaceutical sector, is very interesting, taking advantage of the TRIPS agreement 66.1 and the ability to produce pharmaceutical products. Bangladesh now has developed one of the most advanced and sophisticated pharmaceutical sector in LDCs, being exported to nearly 100 countries and meeting 94% of domestic needs. So it's really important. But it's not enough just giving market access, and you have to help countries to develop the product capacity to take advantage of market access. That's why utilization rate is low. The second one, very quickly, is mobilizing sustainable development finance for productive capacity. Now here, this will require really, I'm glad Felix mentioned about the Addis Ababa action agenda. It will require really reviving the development finance architecture promoted by the Addis Ababa action agenda. The action agenda is needed now than ever before. Unfortunately, before COVID, things were a bit sliding backward. So we really need to revive that. Finally, another thing is with the CDP. You mentioned that I'm member of CDP. One of the things CDP did was in 2016, they did an in-depth study linking productive capacity with SDG capacity and SDGs. And that was followed in 2017 by another study linking productive capacity to graduation of countries from LDC category. This study is conducted in 2016 and 17. They showed that there is intrinsic link between building product capacity and progress in SDGs and graduation from LDC category. Therefore, based on these findings, in 2019, the CDP has recommended that LDCs and their development partners adopt the theme of expanding productive capacity for sustainable development as an organizing framework for the new program of action for LDCs for the period 2021-2030. Now, the committee believes that the concept of product capacity will enable LDCs to design an integrated, coherent, and synergetic program of action and identify the policy actions needed to overcome persistent binding constraints and reduce their vulnerability. Now, we will see whether member states will follow the CTP advice. But this is what has been recommended by CDP to move away from the current approach where, like we saw in Istanbul Program of Action, where the LDC Program of Action is full of action plans without really indicating who's going to implement it, when. So the shopping list approach is really unhelpful, especially now in this decade when SDG has to be implemented and recovery from COVID-19 has to be seriously taken with clear strategies. And we really want the program of action to be a bit innovative and bold as well, and come up with a better approach than just simply listing action lines that nobody implements. Thank you very much.
Well, that was an excellent conclusion to this panel. I will let Patrick have the final word, but before doing that, let me try to summarize in 6 messages what I have heard and the kind of proposal that I think we could table somehow going forward as concrete proposals also for the preparation of the LDC 5 conference that will take place in Doha in 2022. The first message that I take home is that there is a need for the international community to more explicitly recognize the structural impediments to sustainable development in the financing for development or financing for sustainable development agenda. I think that this is a message that we all agree with. The second message is that if this is something that we agree, we also need to identify better way of measuring the vulnerability, the sources of vulnerability, and I will also add the assets of the vulnerable countries, because something that we did not discuss, but I think is quite important, is that there are important assets, for example, biodiversity or others, that are not adequately valued, and that could represent an important asset for attracting investment or changing the incentives in some of the LDCs. So first of all, recognize more explicitly the sources of structural vulnerabilities and impediments to development in the financing for development agenda. Second, measure better the sources of vulnerability, but also the asset, I would say. The third message that I retain is that these measures that should be simple, predictable, and transparent should be used as a guiding criteria for the international support measures, and in particular for the allocation of financing resources. The fourth message that I retain is that the flip side to this is that governments need to have in place adequate framework and strategies to allocate those resources. And what we heard from Felix, for example, is that the current discussion in the G20 about supporting the design and implementation of integrated national financing framework can be an important tool to ensure that the resources that are mobilized are then adequately allocated towards priority areas. The fifth point that I heard, which follows from this one, is that it is important, as we heard from Togo and from Bangladesh, but also from our friend from the Africa Development Bank, that governments have in place concrete strategies for productive transformation, because productive transformation is one way of addressing certain sources of vulnerability, and therefore it is important to have in place this strategy. The sixth and last point that I retain is that the program of action to be adopted in Doha could maybe be more focused and have an overarching theme, as we heard in the last intervention, that looks at one of the most important sources of vulnerability, which is the concentration or the lack of diversification of productive capacity, which of course interacts with climate and with other aspects that were so eloquently discussed and presented by our friend from Bangladesh. I stop here just saying that we stand at the disposal of all the panelists, and we will follow up to the kind suggestion by Secretary General of the Commonwealth to explore how we can build on the analysis that has been done on vulnerability to devise tools to respond, both in terms of the allocation, but also of the national strategies. And several of yours mentioned the tools that we have developed, the Development Center for Production Transformation Reviews, and these are possibly tools that can be used in a parallel exercise. I stop here and I give the floor to Patrick, but let me again thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you. Patrick.
Merci Federico. Tu as dit l'essentiel en ces 5 points de conclusion. Alors je vais juste faire 2 remarques complémentaires qui sont en français cette fois. D'abord, préalablement, je dois demander les auditeurs de nous excuser de n'avoir pu répondre aux nombreuses questions que nous avons reçues pendant le panel. Nous essaierons de répondre à certaines d'entre elles, peut-être par écrit si nous le pouvons. Désolé pour ceux qui sont en ligne et notamment à notre collègue du Mozambique qui s'était inscrit pour parler. Je ne sais pas, je crains que nous ne puissions pas prolonger. Je ne sais pas ce que tu en penses, Federico, mais je crois que nous ne pouvons pas prolonger trop longtemps parce que notre panel se situe dans le Forum pour le financement du développement de l'ECOSOC et d'autres réunions doivent avoir lieu dans la foulée. Simplement, ce que je voudrais dire, c'est appuyer le propos de Federico pour dire que ce qui est important dans ce que nous avons traité, c'est de revenir aux fondamentaux de la catégorie des PMA et des pays vulnérables, c'est-à-dire que ce sont des pays qui font face à des handicaps structurels importants et que la vulnérabilité est un de ces 2 handicaps structurels importants, l'autre étant le manque de capital humain, les problèmes d'éducation et de santé que les membres du CDP connaissent bien, puisque c'est un des 3, dans les 3 critères, il y a le revenu, évidemment qu'on ne peut pas totalement oublier, mais il y a le manque de capital humain et la vulnérabilité structurelle. Et donc, l'allocation doit tenir compte de ces 3. Alors, nous sommes particulièrement concernés par la vulnérabilité structurelle parce que c'est le point qui a été le plus, je dirais, négligé dans l'allocation des ressources concessionnelles. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle nous menons cette proposition, je dirais presque ce combat pour le faire mieux reconnaître en respectant toutes les modalités qui ont été bien émises par la secrétaire générale du Commonwealth et soulignées par Désiré et par Félix. Je pense qu'un des points qui ressort de notre discussion, c'est l'accent qui doit être mis sur cette composante de la vulnérabilité structurelle qui est due au climat. Et donc, effectivement, la prise en compte de la vulnérabilité au changement climatique doit être un élément important de la nouvelle allocation, en particulier pour les PMA et les autres pays vulnérables. Alors, ce n'est pas tout le climat n'est pas à prendre en compte sur la vulnérabilité au changement climatique, c'est celle dont les pays souffrent sans en être responsables. Naturellement, dans l'allocation, il y a toujours les besoins les besoins sont donc le besoin de s'adapter et donc de prendre en compte la vulnérabilité des pays, mais il y a aussi la performance. Et là, il y a cet autre aspect qui doit être lui-même révisé en fonction du climat et de voir quel est le mouvement des pays dans la footprint, dont on parlait Félix tout à l'heure, et de voir comment eux-mêmes tendent à atténuer leur empreinte climatique. Donc, je crois qu'il y a vraiment une remise en cause assez fondamentale de ces problèmes d'allocation et que l'outil de la vulnérabilité doit nous permettre d'avancer dans cette direction et de pouvoir innover en s'adaptant au contexte actuel. Simplement, j'ai bien noté aussi qu'un accent important a été mis sur le renforcement des capacités productives, mais là, nous passons de l'allocation entre pays à l'affectation des fonds. Et naturellement, il y a bien des façons de renforcer la capacité productive. Et un point qui est important, c'est de savoir quel est l'alignement sur les choix spécifiques des pays, car cet renforcement des capacités productives n'est pas uniforme, naturellement. Tous les pays sont différents et ils ont à faire eux-mêmes le choix de leur mode de renforcement des capacités productives. Voilà, merci beaucoup les uns et les autres. Merci en particulier à nos participants extérieurs et encore une fois un remerciement tout particulier à la secrétaire générale du Commonwealth d'avoir participé à cette réunion et de nous avoir donné sa keynote, et puis à tous nos amis de Bruxelles, d'Abidjan, alors pour TEF, je ne sais pas si on doit dire de New York ou d'Addis Abeba, et de notre ami du Bangladesh, et bien sûr notre participant francophone que je remercie d'avoir parlé en français du Togo. Merci à tous et poursuivons la discussion par voies diverses séparées, écrites ou orales, sur ce sujet important, et allons avec confiance vers la conférence de Doha sur les PMA en janvier prochain à Doha. Voilà. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup à nos collègues, à la haute représentante et à tous nos collègues du secrétariat de OHRLLS. Thank you very much and good night and good morning to some of us.
Thank you.
So, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Federico.
Au revoir.
Annalisa.
Au revoir, merci.
Ciao.
Merci, Patrick.